Hey everyone, welcome to Operations Management, and here we will be discussing the future. And that was chapter 4's topic, which is forecasting. Before we get into the types of forecasting, first we will ultimately categorize different time horizons. So there's 3 time horizons we will discuss. And then we will focus specifically, this video will focus on qualitative forecasting. So there's 4 models that we will discuss. So what do we mean by forecasting? Well, we're predicting the future, and it is an art and also a science. This is why we have both qualitative and quantitative forecasting. Why is it important in our business? Well, you name it, you need to forecast properly, whether it's producing the right amount of products to sell. Maybe you need specific inventory to create that product, maybe a dish or something of that nature. You have to have the right staff, the right amount of staff, and you have to have the right facilities. Maybe we need to think about expanding our facilities. All of this has to do with proper forecasting. So as we mentioned, those 3 time horizons, ultimately this is a way to categorize the future. So first we're looking at short-range future, the short-range forecast. And ultimately, this is usually about a quarter of a year. Okay, so think of this particularly helpful when we're looking at our industry, a lot of seasonal changes. So we can forecast for the next season. Usually that's what we mean by short-range forecast. This is really helpful, of course, for scheduling, just making sure that we are prepared for the upcoming season. Then we have our medium-range forecast. So this is a little bit more future-looking, looking at 3 to 3 years. Okay, and this might be helpful for budgeting, particularly making sure you have enough cash on hand for the year. It might be for sales, maybe some strategies as to where you want to start looking to make sales. Okay, so this is a little bit future out. And then finally we have long range, and this is more for maybe investment decisions, whether or not we should expand a location, should we open up a new restaurant, or even just R&D. So, what should we be researching and developing? So this is more longer range, 3+ years. Okay, now short range tends to be more accurate because, of course, shorter time, less variables, less risk associated. So we have a better opportunity to be more accurate. But it's important to understand the 3 different horizons because sometimes we use different methodologies depending on the time horizon. So what type of forecasts are out there? There are economic forecasts, okay? And this, again, is important more for the market overall, okay? But it still plays a role in our industry. For instance, inflation, if it's high inflation, typically, particularly in hospitality, sometimes you'll see less demand because people feel a little bit less well off. They may not spend as much money in the restaurants or in the hotels and things of that nature. Okay, so economic forecasts are really important. Even like currency rates and things of that nature, that's all part of your economic forecast. We also have technological forecast. This, of course, is going to predict the type of technology being used. Again, this can happen, whether or not we should be selling the same types of products. We might want to update our products. Now, in the industry, in hospitality, this could also mean what type of technology we have in our hotel rooms. What are we offering? We need to understand what's coming up, whether or not we should be investing in certain technology or maybe waiting for new types of technology. It might even be how we operate in our restaurants. How are the servers and the hosts communicating? How is the kitchen communicating? What type of technology is out there? What type of POS are out there? All that is important to understand in terms of forecasting. But really our main focus, particularly as an operation manager, are demand forecasts. And as the name suggests, we're basically trying to predict how much sales or how much demand we're going to have in our restaurant or in our hotel. And this is particularly important in regards to being prepared for, as we mentioned, staffing levels and inventory. All of that plays a huge role on whether or not we have accurate demand forecasts and we can plan effectively. So some more points on, particularly demand forecasting, but others as well. So, why is it important to forecast effectively? Well, it affects our supply chain. Okay, and we'll speak more about supply chain management throughout the course. But just for now, just think about whether or not you have a good relationship with your suppliers. You need to be able to tell your suppliers how much inventory you need. So it's really important to forecast effectively so that you have an efficient supply chain. If you don't know how much inventory you need, then you're not going to be very successful in regards to your supply chain. We mentioned this already about having proper staffing. Well, HR needs to understand, how many servers do you need, how many room attendants do you need coming up for the next season. This is all dependent on how well you forecast. And capacity, hotel rooms have a fixed capacity. So, we can't make more hotel rooms, but this is going to be something we might consider for pricing options as well. Now, in regards to operations, we still need to understand capacity, because we need to understand whether or not we can handle, more reservations coming in. Are we going to overbook? Are we going to have more restaurant covers in our restaurant? What are we going to do in terms of capacity? So we need to understand how many people are coming into the restaurant and make sure that we're not dealing with people waiting too long for their tables. Okay, so forecasting is clearly very important in all aspects of the business. This is why it's one of the first skills that we learn as operation managers. Now, in reality, there are a lot of techniques out there, okay? And really, there's a lot of software out there that's going to help you forecast. So, are you going to be using all of these techniques all the time? Yes and no, but it's important to understand the foundations of these concepts, where they're coming from. And of course, you're going to use, that technology when you start creating your own forecast. But, despite all of that technology and all that data, there are certain things we just cannot predict. Okay, and COVID, unfortunately, was a really good example of how we just could not forecast such a, impactful scenario. And typically, whether it's extreme weather sometimes can't be predicted, or of course something like the pandemic. These are things that we just cannot predict. But we try to do as much as we can using the information we have. Okay. So let's talk specifically about qualitative methods. So when we're looking at qualitative methods, the idea here, again, think of it as the art part of our forecasting. And ultimately, it's really used when, we don't have a lot of data. Typically, it's, maybe the reason that might be is if we're launching a new product or a new technology, we're not going to know if it's successful, okay? And, even in our industry, sometimes if we have a new group coming into our hotel, we don't know what their patterns are. We don't know their buying characteristics, or whether they're going to use the lounge a lot, or whether they need a lot of room service. That's another example where we're going to have to sort of use our qualitative methods to figure this out. Okay. And what we mean by qualitative is ultimately it is that art, side of forecasting. There isn't a lot of data. So we have to use our own experience, our own sort of intuition to make decisions on whether or not, we're going to have that group come in and do a lot of room service. We don't know. So this is what we have to call on when we're regarding our qualitative methods. Okay. So there's 4 methods that we're going to discuss, and we'll list them here. Okay. We have our jury of executive opinion, Delphi Method, Salesforce Composite, and the market survey. And we'll take a look at each one in just one moment. So we'll start with number 1, and that's our jury of executive opinion. Now, the best way to think of this type of qualitative method is just imagine a manager meeting or executive meeting where you have your department heads and they're all sitting around, say in a hotel, and those are considered your high-level experts. They're your managers. And basically what they're going to do is they're going to decide, what do you think is going to happen next week? Are we going to have, a busy operation? Do you think this group is going to do a lot of business in the lounge? All of these questions, they might ask, and basically they're just going to come up with some sort of estimation based off of the conversation that they have. Now, again, they're going to use that managerial experience. There might be some data part of it, but for the most part, they're just going to use their experience that they had. They might have managers that have been there for 10, 20 years. They probably have a good understanding of what to expect. Okay. Now, why do we use this method? When is it effective? Well, it's effective when we just need to have a quick kind of decision. So again, if we have monthly or weekly meetings, then this is a good opportunity to have this opinion being used. Okay. Now, the disadvantage of this is that because we're all in one room, and maybe you have somebody that's maybe a little bit more vocal than someone else, and they say, yeah, it's going to be busy next week, and everyone just simply agrees. They nod their head, and that's it. So there is a disadvantage or a likelihood of the groupthink bias. So that's something you have to think about with the jury of executive opinion. So with that bias said, we're going to move on to the Delphi method. Okay, and this is actually one of the advantages of the Delphi method, you'll see in just one moment, is that there is no groupthink. And the reason for that, well, once we break it down here. So again, iterative group process. Basically what that means is that we just ask the same questions to our participants until we get sort of a consensus. So the consensus is reached not with everyone in one room. Okay, and let me give you an example in a second here. So again, in this method, one thing you can already see is that you have more participants than just the experts. Okay, we actually have 3 participants. So we have the decision makers, okay, and they're the ones that actually evaluate all the data that comes in. Okay, we have the staff that sort of administer the survey or the data. And then the respondents. These are the people. So in this case, the respondents are the experts. Okay, they're the ones that are going to make some sort of decision. And what's happening in this, and let's use an example. We'll take a look at it more detailed later on. But an example here is the National Restaurant Association. It's an American association. And what they do every year is they send out, okay, so imagine them as the decision makers. What they do is they send out a survey. Okay, their staff sends out a survey, and they survey the chefs. They survey, all the chefs in the States, or at least quite a few of them, and they'll ask them, what food trends do you see coming up for the following year, for the next year? So again, what's happening is these chefs or these experts are going to decide, what the food trends are for next year. Of course, this is all based on their experience. There's not really any data to support it. But this is what they're doing. They're trying to find some sort of consensus as to what the trends are. So again, if you go back to the no groupthink, the reason for that is because these surveys are sent out to the chefs individually, and then the chefs make their decision. They fill out the survey. They might say, top 10 trends for next year. And then what happens is all that information goes back to the decision makers, and they're going to evaluate the responses of all those chefs. And then they're going to say, okay, based off of all of those surveys, we see the top 10 food trends. Okay, so that's an example of using a Delphi method. And the advantage of that is that there's no groupthink involved. Now, what is the disadvantage? Well, you can see it's a little bit more time consuming than the jury of executive opinion because it's all individual. And also it can become a little expensive as well if you have to actually hire a staff to send out the surveys and gather all the information and all that. So that's one of the disadvantages. It takes a little bit longer, and it is more time consuming. Okay, but again, the advantage is there's no groupthink. So that's number 2. Number 3 is the Salesforce Composite. So this is specifically more about forecasting the demand or the sales that you'd have. So imagine if you're in a hotel and your director of sales has to go out and ask all his salespeople, how many sales do you project in the next quarter? Okay, so that's what they would do. They would ask them. They would get all that information. Each salesperson would provide that data for, or at least again their projection. Okay. Now they might, this could be a little bit more data driven. Maybe they already have, definite sales on the books, but they could have some tentative or prospective, group sales that they may or not get. And again, that's based off of their judgment, deciding whether or not they're going to get those sales. Okay, so again, in this case, the salespeople are the experts, and they are projecting basically how much sales they're going to have in the next quarter or the next year. Now, of course, with that said, because they're salespeople and they want to promote how well they're doing, they might be a little bit optimistic with their forecast. Okay, so that's one of the disadvantages of it. Okay, so they might underestimate, or they could do the opposite. They might underestimate their forecast just so that it can look good and exceed the budget. Okay, so it could go either way. So unfortunately, there might be a bias because you're actually projecting your own work. Okay, and sometimes there's a bias associated with that. So just be careful of that bias. Okay, and then we have another example or another method, which is the fourth method, which is the market survey. Okay, now this is interesting because now we're moving away from the people working for the companies, and now we're actually going to be asking the guest or the customer. Okay, so we can use this if we are trying to determine maybe we want to design a new product, or maybe we're looking at opening up a new hotel and we want to know, what are the top 5 things that people want in their hotel room. Okay, so this is a great way to do some sort of market survey, right? And this is great. Unfortunately, there might be a disadvantage where customers say they want something, but they'll actually do something differently, right? So there is that disadvantage as well. Remember, all of these are based off of opinions. So sometimes there might be a bit of maybe pessimism or optimism sometimes. We have to be careful with that, okay? Let's use an example here. So a really interesting company, a tourism company that we use here in Canada, Destination Canada. So they're like a marketing company. They do a lot of surveys. And one thing they'd like to do is they like to get an idea of how other travelers are interested in coming to Canada. Okay, so obviously, particularly during COVID, there was a lot of questions of when people felt comfortable traveling back, comfortable even traveling at all. So one survey that they sent out is whether or not to see if Americans were interested in traveling back to Canada. Okay, so they've done a survey here. This is quite recent, April 19th to 24th. Okay. And again, of course, this was focused more about health and safety. And they asked questions such as, do you feel that it's safe to travel to Canada? Okay. So again, this is kind of the response. Okay. And I believe this is, most positive is an absolutely agree. This is kind of, somewhat agree. And this is somewhat disagree. So there's still... It's getting better, okay, if you tracked it throughout the pandemic, okay? But again, these are just health and safety survey to see whether or not people are interested in traveling back to Canada. So again, this is a great example of Destination Canada does this a lot. They send out a lot of market surveys just to have an idea of what type of demand we might expect in Canada, particularly in this case from the American travelers. Okay, so this is another way that we can forecast what to expect in terms of people coming back to travel to Canada. So those are your 4 qualitative approaches to forecasting. Okay, and next week or next video, let's be more specific, we will look at our quantitative. Okay, so today, in this video, we discussed the 3 time horizons, and then we looked at the 4 qualitative models, explained some good opportunities to use those techniques. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.